Shall we begin? I'll give people a moment to get seated. While you're getting seated, I want to thank all of our amazing panelists from today and our keynotes. I said to Ryan a couple of months ago, any of these panelists could be keynote speakers. They're so articulate and thoughtful. I also want to thank our incredible musicians from this morning. So hope you've had a good day, and the weather seems to be cooperating as well. I am very excited about our first keynote speaker, who most of you probably know, but who I will introduce nonetheless. Oh, by the way, after our gathering here tonight, for those who want to, we're going to have a group picture. So we assemble in front of the sanctuary here. If you don't want to be in it, that's okay, but we hope you feel welcome. Tania Tetlow was named 33rd president of Fordham University. We also have to thank her for her hospitality next door, on February 10th, 2022, and took office on July 1st. She is the first lay person and first woman to serve as president of Fordham. Prior to this, President Tetlow was the 17th president of Loyola University, New Orleans. She was the first woman and the first lay person to lead Loyola since the Jesuits founded the university in 1912. Prior to joining Loyola, President Tetlow served as senior vice president and chief of staff, as well as the Felder Fayard Professor of Law at Tulane University. As a law professor, President Tetlow's research helped persuade the Department of Justice to reimagine its regulation of constitutional policing. She also directed Tulane's Domestic Violence Law Clinic. Before her career in academia, President Tetlow was an associate at Phelps Dunbar, litigating complex commercial transactions. She also served as an assistant United States attorney, prosecuting everything from violent crime to fraud cases. President Tetlow graduated cum laude from Tulane University with a Bachelor of Arts degree in American Studies and is a magna cum laude graduate of Harvard Law School, where she earned her Juris Doctor degree. A Catholic who was born in New York and grew up in New Orleans, President Tetlow has deep family ties to the Jesuits and to Fordham, which is an understatement, because her parents met there as graduate students in the late 1960s. Her father, in fact, is a former Jesuit, and her mother, a scripture scholar. I have to tell this, when she was appointed, many Catholics, and certainly all Jesuits, said, "Is she the niece of Joe Tetlow, the great Jesuit spiritual writer?" And she is. But of course now, Joe Tetlow has asked, "Are you the uncle of Tania Tetlow?" So please welcome the president of Fordham University, Tania Tetlow.
I am here to tell you that you are loved, bathed in the overwhelming love and acceptance of God, the love of Jesus, who made it a central tenet of our faith to avoid the sin of marginalizing people, defining them as other, treating them as less worthy. To marginalize is a sin, to love is our command. You are loved by the church made up of the people of God, the church we claim, the church we fight for, because we know it must constantly strive to better live up to the Gospels. And you are loved by Fordham University and a growing tide of Catholic institutions who realize it is not enough to love you in a passive, we love everyone kind of way. We love you We respect you, we value you, and we run our universities with and for you. I am in awe of your courage, of the depth of your loving commitments that have required such courage. I wish that the world did not demand such strength from you, but you are nonetheless fiercely strong because you've had no choice. And I imagine you are often seriously tired. In the activism I've done in my life around domestic violence and sexual assault, in fighting racism in the criminal justice system, I often think 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. Because progress, visible, shining progress, gets met with a moment of real self-congratulations in this country. Aren't we so virtuous? Don't we feel so good about ourselves? But then begins the vicious blowback. There are so many examples of that cycle in these last few years. After a decade of yelling into the wind, Me Too created a moment I never thought I'd see. A country suddenly facing the scourge of rape, domestic violence, sexual harassment, and then we elected a president caught bragging about sexual assault. After the summer of Black Lives Matter marches across the country, a time of serious moral reckoning, we now suffer through a wave of states attempting to literally rewrite history books and to ban diversity and equity training. By the way, I'm seriously curious if you're still allowed to quote the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal in these states, or if it's verboten. And after a remarkable transformation in attitudes and understanding of LGBTQ issues, and a new willingness to acknowledge and celebrate the complexity of gender and gender identity, we see a vicious opposition, waves of hostile legislation, violence, including mass shootings. We see the terrible toll on our students' mental health, on their sense of safety and belonging. And I imagine that many of you here are exhausted and afraid. What I pray fervently is that it is the seismic force of the progress that creates the flailing, terrible backlash. And we cannot forget that progress. Those eager to scare us now want us to despair, to lose our greatest weapon, hope. And so we must still celebrate the progress and the sea change in attitudes in this country on sexuality and all of the intersecting issues of race and gender, nationality, religion, disability. We celebrate the progress because we can never, ever forget the heroes who got us here. And there are so many millions of heroes in this movement. I remember well the week in the mid-90s when my sister found the unbelievable courage to come out to our family and friends. She told me how worried she was about the stupid things they might say and how much that would wound her. She worried that some of our extended family would walk away from her altogether. She started with our parents, talking to them by phone so she wouldn't at least have to witness their facial expressions. My dad, a psychologist, insisted quite proudly that he knew all along. My mom managed to say all the right things. My sister never did tell the conservative extended relatives, though I watched them over time work through the denial of the obvious truth to overt acceptance in their way. My favorite reaction was from the dear friend, a little younger than us, whom I saw right after my sister called to tell her. She said, and I quote, "Well, if Sonia is gay, then being gay must be fine." And then she said, "I feel so cosmopolitan now." I cannot fathom the magnitude of courage shown by millions of people over the course of human history. It is a courage that gathered speed and snowballed and changed the world. I wish I could know each of your stories and what happened. Who were you terrified to tell? Who surprised you? Who broke your heart? This is your collective power, the ministry of reconciliation. to find the strength to forgive ignorance, to know that love might not be enough to conquer fear and hate, but to have the courage to try. As a nation, as a world, the distance we have traveled has been remarkable, but so is the pushback. So why is it so strong? I don't have any answers. When I study the history of race in this country, the creation of an elaborate and fierce caste system, I see the importance of the binary to support that system. American law created a racial binary with an absolutism unknown elsewhere. The one-drop rule protected the hierarchy, made segregation possible. It is an even older system wrapped up in the fundamentalist version of so many of the world's religions to divide humanity into two absolutes of gender as well, subordinate women and dominant men. And those who would blur the lines or leap over them or love someone they are forbidden to love, they challenge everything. Because in many ways, societal contempt for lesbians has always been rooted in their taking on the trappings and confidence of men. Societal contempt for gay men has been rooted in their rejection of toxic masculinity, their inexplicable willingness to relinquish their power as swaggering men. Our fierce attachment to gender as binary, as an absolute, as moral and political imperative, makes the presence of LGBT and especially trans people anathema. In this fundamentalist world, you exist as a challenge to everything held dear. I was raised in a different worldview. My mom is a biblical scholar who taught me to look for clues in the Gospels, that Jesus preached outside rather than in the synagogues, because that's where men and women both could gather. That he first revealed his resurrection to the women. My father was a Jesuit for 17 years before he left to have a family. He impressed upon us constantly the central message of the Gospels: love, courage, sacrifice, gratitude. He used to mock those who claimed to read the Bible literally but then contorted it beyond recognition. They think Jesus was just kidding. And he was also a clinical psychologist. He taught my sisters and me that it is almost impossible to know what biological differences are created by sex because we are so steeped in the social norms of gender. As a point of pride, and perhaps in part because he had no sons to treat differently, he pushed his daughters to embrace our ambition and our intellect. And when his middle daughter found the courage to come out to him, he responded not just with tolerance, but with utter respect for her courage, thrilled that she had found love. And that is the most extraordinary part of the progress we should celebrate, is that we move beyond mere tolerance to respect, to admiration. To me, that came from the move to legalize gay marriage and to embed it as a constitutional right. The fight for marriage reminded Americans of the most profound shared values of what it means to commit your heart and life to someone through sickness and health till death do we part. The loyalty and love, the work and the effort. My sister and her wife have been utterly devoted to each other for 24 years. They have lived with abundant joy and they have comforted each other through terrible suffering. They support each other with a quality which remains far rarer in heterosexual relationships. But the reason I imagine that I'm here today is to answer the harder question. How do I walk the tightrope of leading a Catholic institution, given my own struggles with some of the Church's teachings? Well, there are certain absolutes. Before I took the job at Loyola, and then again before I took the job at Fordham, I made very clear to the search committees that I will never say anything in any setting that I wouldn't say in front of my sister, ever. There are hard questions about how and whether you can make a difference being at the table. When I ran a domestic violence clinic, I spent a fair amount of time turning up the heat on the failings of the legal system. I went to the press, made sure I got embarrassing coverage of those who had failed us. But I also found sometimes that I could persuade. Not always, not even usually, but sometimes. And when you get people's wholehearted conversion, it matters so much more than forcing their hand, because then they're with you. My favorite example was a female judge who routinely denied protective orders to desperate petitioners, saying things in her out loud voice like, "You don't know what's normal in our community." The activist community fumed and railed in private, but we ultimately decided to try one last thing before going nuclear. We asked the judge to give us a training in the best practices of domestic violence law. It was a Hail Mary, but somehow it worked. Her ego led her to say yes, and then she had to actually read the best practices of domestic violence law and to vouch for them. And she ended up standing before us in tears, realizing the suffering she had caused, the lives she had endangered. This is the ministry of reconciliation that so many of you have been doing your whole lives. Those moments of grace that interrupt the endless disappointments. Those moments of grace that give us hope. So I find myself at the table in Catholic higher education, a place my mother, who has fought the good fight to push the church that she loves, a place my mother never imagined her daughter would be. I have no notion of whether that may matter on the margins, in tiny interactions and big ones, but it's worth a try. But how to navigate these waters? How to avoid waving a red flag to a bull and inviting attacks, usually from outside of our communities, that make our students feel less safe. This is what I carefully wrote for Outreach's website last year. I do not know whether the church will change its stance on issues of sexuality as it has on other subjects. For now, we walk a fine line between respect for the church's current teachings and the requirement to support our students. But here's the thing. There's something liberating about the fact that there are no answers that avoid controversy. Therefore, we can just focus on doing the right thing. The Gospels tell several stories of religious authorities challenging Jesus with questions on doctrinal matters, demanding that he either acknowledge obedience to the rules or risk a public stance condemning them. Jesus always found delightful ways to evade the trick question. He refused to judge the excluded. He leaned into love as the core governing principle. Universities can't be passive. It's not enough to pride ourselves at Catholic colleges on generally supporting our students, hoping that LGBTQ students feel the love of God because we proclaim it to all. Because we represent a church whose doctrines make many of those same students feel rejected and judged, exiled and condemned. So silent approval will not be nearly good enough. We look at the data around suicide and despair, fear, lack of belonging, and we know we have to do more. I would also add from an extensive Title IX study that we did at Tulane, vulnerability to extraordinary rates of sexual assault. As we know from countless parables, it's not enough to offer a false equality that is not equity. We give our students what they each need, not just what we offer everyone else. We meet students where they are. We care for the whole person. That requires the variety of services that you know well, the special outreach and support, student groups, robust community and counseling. It requires treating students with respect and how we design housing policy and campus records. It requires really hiring for mission, because those who would add to the suffering of our LGBTQ students are not acting as true Catholics, not following church teachings, and cannot do their jobs properly at a university. It means listening to our communities intensely, asking them what they need and how we can help. Most of all, as the church under Francis has begun to make clear, and as the Gospels have always made clear, we need to proclaim God's love for our LGBT brothers and sisters and siblings. And we need to proclaim our love too. I have this haunting memory when I was in college 30 years ago of seeing a trans student from a distance, seeing her obvious despair as she navigated about the campus, worrying about her, but never reaching out. I should have reached out. Now I will reach out. My Uncle Joe, which you heard, is a 92-year-old Jesuit and expert in Ignatian spirituality and the greatest man I know, presided in my missioning mass at Loyola. He ended his homily with this, which made my sister feel so good and then made everyone laugh. In God, there is no man or woman, no slave or free, no black or white, no gay or straight, and even, dare I say, no Democrat or Republican. Thank you so much, my friends. I'm so happy and proud to be with you today.
You can see why I always tell Tania Jesuits are so happy to have her at Fordham and to have her in the family. So I'm going to ask Tania a few questions, and then I'll turn it over to you. You talked very movingly about your sisters coming out, and I wonder how that affected you personally. I mean, had you known many LGBTQ people? How might it have affected your professional life too?
So she told me when I was a law student, and she didn't actually tell me on purpose. She sent me some of her poetry she'd been writing, and I don't know if it was subconsciously on purpose or not, but one of the poems revealed it, and I called her immediately and was like, wow. I remember, this was the early 90s, being raised in ignorance on these issues and not yet really challenging myself on it, but beginning to. And then when she told me, it changed everything, because I know her, I love her more than life itself, and so then I understood, right? And that is the profound transition that all of society went when people like Dick Cheney's daughter comes to him and says, "This is who I am, Daddy," and he has to go through a much more profound transition than I did to grapple with that. And I just think it's the most incredible thing. So did it have any effect on me? No, not at all, not at all. I mean, it didn't. I was a student. And with her, I have her permission to talk about her today, but she is not in the closet, but she is private. So I don't talk about her because she gets mad at me when I just throw her name around. But she told me that this would be okay.
Well, thank you, and
yes.
Thanks her too. We have a number of people here who work in college and university ministry, and also are teaching in colleges and universities. Fordham is a very welcoming place. What advice, as someone who's been in higher education for a long time, would you give to people who might be working in colleges or other schools where things aren't as open, perhaps where the diocese isn't as open? What kinds of tips would you suggest?
We were talking about that earlier in the panel discussion. I think that, I've spent a lifetime reading about the civil rights movement, and those decisions, those endless decisions about how much you push and in what way, and the strategy of that, and the politics of seeming respectable in order to be heard. Those go back a long way. And those are really hard, painful, moral/strategic choices that every movement has grappled with. So I think I'd recommend reading about those other movements and cutting yourself some slack for the fact that there are no easy answers. And there aren't really wrong answers either, right? So you know what your intentions are, you know what moves you, and then the strategic choices are your best effort to get it right. But when you're doing it for the right reasons, there are a lot of different paths to get there to be effective, and you'll pick the one that's right for you.
Thank you. Last question I have is, I think the question of the transgender student on campus is certainly the leading edge for LGBTQ kids. Can you talk about what their experiences are like? I know you've just gotten to Fordham, but maybe even at Loyola New Orleans, things you've found helpful, things you've found useful in terms of including them in the community, kinds of steps that different universities have taken.
Well, there are all the logistical questions around facilities and roommate assignments and housing. All of those things are the bare minimum. But what I found at Loyola New Orleans is it is both intensely diverse on every metric. 40% Pell, a third first gen, 50% diverse, and with a really vibrant, flourishing LGBTQ community. And it's a school that focuses in many ways on creativity in the creative industries. So there is such joyfulness in that community, such desire to celebrate. And I remember being asked when I first got there, well, there's going to be a drag show. Do you have a problem with that? And the lawyer in me said, well, do we have a dress code? No. Well, then what's the problem? Anyway.
Good answer.
Right.
So questions, you can shout them out and I'll repeat them for people that might not hear them. Questions for President Tetlow? Yes.
Yes.
So speaking of dress
we had an
codes,
interaction on the
about
shoes.
His shoes.
Yes.
Shoes.
I have these beautiful shoes on that one of our trustees at Loyola New Orleans, who was married right after the Supreme Court decision. He and his husband were married by then Vice President Joe Biden. And that was in our alumni magazine, and we got some flack for that, but he was one of our board members. And he bought me these shoes because he found my taste in shoes appalling. So I wore them tonight for him. I love him dearly. Advice for those who teach at the high school level. You know, I can imagine it is harder and easier in some ways because it's a smaller community, potentially, depending on the high school, where people know each other and you can grow that trust and have more levers of influence over the culture than we do in higher ed. At the same time, adolescence is terrifying enough without that extra, set of terrors. And so I don't have specific advice because I've never had the honor of working in a high school, but I can imagine, just from my memories of high school, that it's all about those same constant messages of not just tolerance, but acceptance and love, of how you build a place that has zero tolerance for bullying. I'm watching my daughters in a new school here in New York and just finished 5th grade, but the school does a brilliant job of insisting on those overarching messages of how we treat each other in profound ways. And if you're in a place where you're gonna get punished or bring condemnation for being more overt than that, what you can never go wrong on is the how we treat each other messages. And from everything I know about the causes of things like domestic violence, the root cause, as best we can tell, is selfishness. And so if we attack that in whatever brand and form it's taking, I think that's the way to go. So our core moral teachings, those are the answer. So the question was, from my legal background, any predictions or thoughts about the legal battles that are anti-trans? I don't know enough about, I'm trying to think of whether there's any chance the courts would strike those down as unconstitutional, potentially. I don't think this Supreme Court would. But whether the court will go backwards on some of Obergefell and other decisions, I'm not sure that they will, and this is not a legal prediction, but when you look at the polling and how huge a sea change we've seen on support for gay marriage as a civil right. I think in '96 it was 27% support, and now it's 71% was the latest poll I looked up. And then when you look at younger people, right, that you realize that change is just going to keep growing. It may not matter to the court, it doesn't matter overtly to the court, but I think they are aware that that is a Pandora's box that to shut would be hugely problematic. And then what do you do in a country where marriage, states are supposed to recognize each other's marriages, right? So then what do you do if that is so very fractured in terms of what is allowed and what isn't? But I am now babbling well beyond my actual legal expertise. I'm going to look at another law professor in the audience and acknowledge that. But so we'll see. I don't know. So fundraising, big part of my job, and do I walk a tightrope there sometimes? Well, I will tell you one story that I love, and I tell it with total confidence that the person who was part of the story does not remember this conversation, so I'll never I'll get in trouble with him. But I had a meeting early on at Loyola with one of our biggest potential donors. And Loyola doesn't have a lot of hugely wealthy potential donors, so it was a big deal, and the stakes for the school are very high. But I said to him, because he's very traditional Catholic, I take very seriously being the first lay president, and was about to launch into my understanding of Jesuit and how devout I am and all this. And he looked at me and he said, "It's not just that, it's that you're a woman that bothers people." And you know how normally you think of the right thing to say like a week later after fuming and pacing forever? I actually thought of it in the moment, and I said, "Well, Joe, there's not much I can do about that you would approve of." And it went straight over. And then we were fast friends after that, and he ended up being very generous with the university, and so it worked out. But yeah, I do. I think sometimes the ability to never say anything I don't believe, but to figure out how to persuade, that I think is honorable work. So I make sure the cock's not crowing, right? But there are ways that I can try to see if there's something where I can find the common value. So if I have a donor who's upset by affirmative action, for example, with the donors of our Catholic institutions, they were often first generation to go to college. So I can bring them back to that and what it means to not squander the talent that the world would squander, and what it means to have grit and resilience because you've overcome obstacles, and they agree with that, right? So it's to find the end run that really helps them see. So as first woman president navigating these spaces, well, part of it is I grew up thinking of every Jesuit as my uncle. So they got my back. I feel so comfortable there. And so that feels like the opposite of a patriarchal space to me. And I think that to me is core to everything. I mean, this is, I remember in my first province day at Loyola, so there's, 100 Jesuits in a room, which would intimidate a lot of people in my situation. But I went in and said, how many of you have known me since the week I was born? And a bunch of hands go up. So I don't know. I just feel like in many ways, I'm very aware of filters and very aware of the tightrope I have to navigate, but I try not to let it bother me because I don't see how they see me. I'm just looking out through my eyes and looking forward. And at some point along the way, just got really comfortable with that. So I don't want to ever have a job I'm not perfectly willing to walk away from if I had to. And I feel just comfortable and, trying to do good, and we'll see what happens. All right. What brings me hope? Oh, so many things, right? When you work around students, I mean, we get tired, right? But we have this force magnifier. They get all excited and they have all this energy and they're going to go out in the world, and there are so many of them. So that brings me such hope. I mean, doing the work in the domestic violence clinic was really hard, but I have now dozens and dozens of lawyers around America. Actually, one of them's on the Manhattan City Council, who are now doing this work, right, and multiplying it. So I love that. But I also think you can't do this work without being an optimist, because otherwise it'll just kill you. So, I mean, hope, as I said, is our greatest weapon. It's not naive to hope, it's brave.
Well, I want to thank President Tetlow for not only welcoming us next door at her university. We had Jesuit ordinations last weekend, and outside the church I said, thank you for welcoming me to your church. She said, it's not my church. I said, I think it is now your church. So we want to thank her, also thank her for her visionary leadership and her time with us tonight. Thank you so much, President Tetlow.
On behalf of Outreach and also as a Fordham alumnus, I'd like to thank President Tetlow for that fantastic speech, and also for being, as she talked about, brave enough to come and speak here, especially so early in your presidency. A brief note about tomorrow morning. We will convene back here at the Church of St. Paul's at 10 a.m. for another opening prayer led by Bruce Ramaker, and then we will begin with our next round of panels back at Fordham at 11 a.m. As Father Martin had mentioned, for those of you who are interested in being in a group photo, which is not mandatory, if you would like to be in the photo, you can gather now at the base of the sanctuary here and we can take that picture. Thank you.